Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I am your host Deepak. I am delighted to welcome Professor Peter Bamberger, an esteemed academic and researcher in the field of organizational behavior, as our guest for today's podcast episode. Professor Bamberger's research focuses on several critical areas, including employee behavioral health, substance misuse, trauma and negative emotional states, compensation strategy, and pay communication, cognition and metacognition in team context, employee adjustment during period of transition, and employee helping and help-seeking behaviors. In this episode, Professor Peter will share insights from his book, Exposing Pay, Pay Transparency, and what it means for employees, employers, and public policy. Thank you, Professor Peter Bamberger, for joining us today. We are truly honored by your presence and delighted to have you share your very valuable insights with us.
My pleasure. Looking forward to it.
Professor Peter, could you give us a brief overview of your book and share some insight into the research you conducted for it?
So the book is based on about 15 years of research that I've been doing on the topic of pay transparency and employee pay knowledge. And it summarizes my own research and the research of several other people up till about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. So since then, there have been a couple of really interesting studies that have come out that we can talk about as well during the course of the interview. The book starts with kind of a review of the field of compensation, which as a scholarly domain is relatively recent. We trace the history back until the 1950s, really, to understand systematic pay models and how what we view as a contemporary approach to pay emerged in Western organizations and then spread throughout the world. And prior to that time in the 1950s, the issue of pay transparency poked its head up a little bit here and there, primarily in the terms of executive pay. For example, in the 1930s in Europe and the United States, shareholders were concerned about executive pay. Why their profits were low when in fact their senior employees, the CEOs of the companies that they employed, were making so many millions of dollars. And that prompted legislation to open up pay rates for senior executives in firms. And subsequent to that, we saw some moves, legislative moves, to make pay more transparent. But as I document in the book, the real moves towards pay transparency only emerged really about 20 years ago. And most of this was prompted by concerns about gender pay equity, both in the United States and in Europe. And subsequently that spread around the world because, as you know, in most parts of the world, women are paid only about 75% of what men are paid. So it's become, at the time that I started studying this, it became a very, very hot topic. A hot topic that many people had lots of opinions about. But like many contentious issues, there was limited research. So everybody kind of espoused a perspective without any evidence to back those perspectives up. And what the book really covers is the evidence of what pay transparency does, and what it does at various levels of organizational analyses, as well as what those implications are for enterprise strategy and policy making at the societal level.
Yeah, very insightful, Professor. How is pay transparency defined in the context of modern workplaces, and how has this concept evolved in recent years?
So when the concept was first raised and first studied, this goes back to the 1960s. It was raised largely as an issue of employee knowledge of other people's pay. And this was some of the early work done by Ed Lawler, who's now a retired professor at USC in California. And there were several studies that looked at the issue of pay transparency, which they defined largely as the accuracy of employee understandings of how their pay is situated relative to that of others. And we can talk more about those studies because there's some really interesting findings there that were replicated, 50 years later. So things don't really change very much in that regard. But their definition was, as I said, the degree to which employees have an understanding of how others in the organization are paid. Since then, several scholars, Ingrid Fulmer being one of them, have broken down the topic of pay transparency into three main elements. One element has to do with the ability of employees to communicate to one another about their pay. In many organizations around the world, there are restrictions on employees with regard to their ability to talk about their pay. And in some companies around the world, when you get employed, you sign a contract that actually stipulates that you will not discuss your pay with any other employee, that this is between you and the employer and it's private information and it's not to be disclosed. However, in most Western countries, in the United States and Canada, all of the EU, these types of regulations are now illegal. In the United States, they've basically been illegal since the 1930s, reestablished that the law determining that employees have the right to communicate their pay to each other was a law, the National Labor Relations Act, a law that was passed in the 1930s. And it was only in the 1950s that the Supreme Court actually started reviewing cases on the topic. And since then, consistently finding that employees, based on the National Labor Relations Act, cannot be restricted in their ability to speak to other employees or to communicate to other employees about their pay. So this is one aspect. And it's an aspect that, for the most part, has been decided a long time ago, that there should be transparency. It shouldn't be an issue. But what we find is that in most parts of the world, employees are not aware that they have this right. And even if they do have the right, they're kind of hesitant to act upon this right. So this is one aspect of pay transparency. A second part of pay transparency has commonly been referred to as procedural pay transparency, or transparency about pay processes. So if we ask most employees, how is pay determined in your organization? What are the criteria that determine why one person is paid more in your organization than the other? And what determines what those differentials in pay are? Most employees will have no real understanding of this. And to a large extent, employers prefer not to make any efforts to disclose any information about how pay is determined, because the more you talk about it, the more questions can be raised. And these are topics that most employers, most managers prefer not to have to discuss. As a result, employee pay knowledge is pretty minimal. What we know is that this can be problematic, not only for the employee, but also for the employer. That generally, employee understanding of how resources are allocated, pay resources are allocated in a firm, as long as they're allocated in a reasonable, merit-based way, it can be actually beneficial for all parties involved to communicate that knowledge. So this procedural pay transparency is a second type of transparency that we analyze in the book, and is important for employers to understand. And obviously for policymakers to understand. The third type, or the third dimension of pay transparency, is the one that attracts the most attention, and that's just what we call distributed pay transparency. And this is transparency about actual pay rates. How much a position is paid relative to another position, what the range of pay is for a given level of pay in the organization or a set of jobs in the organization, or even how much individuals are paid in the organization. So we have different types of distributed pay transparency depending on how much information is given, whether it's aggregated information that's made transparent or whether it's individual level transparency that's made transparent. Can we pause for 1 second?
Professor, what are the potential benefits of pay transparency for employees and how it affects employee motivation and satisfaction?
Well, the main benefit for employees is that it provides them with a sense of pay equity, that they're being treated fairly in the organization and not being ripped off. But there are other benefits as well. Understanding how pay is allocated and what types of rewards are rewarded for what types of activities provides employees with clues, a lot of important signals as to where they should be spending their time, what they should how they should be investing their own efforts in terms of what's going to be most rewarded, because the rewards go for what's most important for the organization. But I think the primary element is for employees is the sense of equity, the sense of fairness, and the trust that they generate in their employers, which is really, really important. I mean, if I work in an organization, I think you would probably feel the same way. You want to have a good degree of trust in the people that you're working with. And lacking that, you're probably not going to stay in that organization very long. So it's a basic element for satisfaction in the workplace, right? The sense that you feel that you're being treated fairly and that you can trust those on whom you depend. So that's probably the greatest benefit for employees.
Okay, yeah. What are some of the key challenges employers encounter when implementing pay transparency?
What are the key contingencies?
Key challenges.
Challenges.
Yeah.
So one of I guess the main challenge that they confront is that the more pay information they provide, the more they can be questioned about their pay system. So we, in some of our research, have found that as long as the pay system is in fact equitable and merit-based and justifiable, there are actually few challenges that employers face. In fact, they're largely benefits for providing that information, particularly in terms of retaining human capital. And we've been able to demonstrate this both at the individual level and at the firm level. The problem comes, and the challenges organizations face, is when they're forced to make their pay more transparent, when their pay system is anything but equitable, when they can't defend the systems that are in place and the differentials that they have in the organization, with some people making a lot more money than other people. In those situations, the challenges are immense because when that becomes public, it's embarrassing, and it can be devastating. It can drive certain people out of the organization that you really need to retain. Organizations are then faced with having to correct that situation. And unfortunately, for organizations, this can come at a high cost. They're not going to necessarily reduce the pay of, for example, a top-level male employee just to ensure that there's equity restored. They're likely going to have to keep that pay level constant, when in fact that employee may be expecting to get more pay and maybe looking elsewhere to get more pay. So they're at risk of losing that top-level male employee, and they need to increase the pay of the female employee, which means higher labor costs. So that's a huge challenge. It can actually pose economic challenges to the firm. But other challenges to the organization are much more kind of implicit, and this is at the managerial level. When pay becomes more transparent, managers feel that they're going to be more at risk of employees challenging their decisions, particularly in terms of pay for performance. Why was it that I was rated lower than another employee? How do I know that I was rated lower than another employee? Well, another employee got a larger bonus than I did, or so it may seem, or a larger merit increase than I got, or so it may seem based on the information that's been disclosed. So one of the results of this that we find in our research is that managers try to avoid these conflicts by reducing the differentials. So this creates a huge challenge for organizations. When pay is more transparent, the natural tendency of all of us is to reduce the damage, to reduce the potential conflicts that can emerge from that information showing disparities, with everyone essentially making around the same amount of money. Hence, no conflict. But hence, potentially, higher quality human capital going to where the grass is greener, where those differentials really do exist in other organizations. And as a result, we may lose some very, very valuable human capital. So this, again, is another challenge that's faced by employers when putting this in place. Other challenges faced by employers have to do with collaboration. Our studies demonstrate that when pay is more transparent, individuals tend to compare not so much against those making less than them, but our natural impulse is to always do an upward comparison, comparing against people making more than us. And when we do that comparison, we tend to see it in more negative terms because they're making more than us. And then there's a natural tendency to question whether or not I really want to go out of my way to help those individuals, because they're already making more than I am. Why should I spend my time and effort to help those people that are getting what I should be getting, right? So we actually demonstrate that in certain cases, pay transparency can generate reduction in collaborative behavior. And this too is another challenge faced by organizations. I think there are ways of addressing all of these challenges, but these challenges definitely do exist.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Professor Peter. My next question is, how does pay transparency influence public policy and labor regulations?
So it's more that the opposite, that pay regulations are actually affecting pay transparency. The lack of pay transparency, you could say, is actually generating a tendency of policymakers to step into the arena and enact regulations to mandate greater transparency in pay. And again, we last year we saw the European Union adopting an EU-wide directive requiring EU member states to move towards a common approach to pay transparency, which really is revolutionary when you look at it. And what's driving all of that, again, is this concern with unexplainable pay disparities, primarily with regard to women, but also with regard to minorities in various parts of the world. When I say unexplainable, that means that when economists run a model to try to understand where those disparities are coming from, perhaps they're coming from differences in the types of jobs people are performing or people's level of education that they bring to the workplace. But when you look at all of these factors and control for all these factors, you still have a sizable proportion of a pay difference, disparity, that's unexplainable other than the fact that there are differences, gender differences, or ethnic differences between individuals, which most of us would find problematic as a basis for determining how much people should be paid. So this is what's really driving regulation. And what we find is where those regulations have been adopted, we do see a narrowing of those pay disparities. Where this has actually been studied in Canada and in Scandinavian countries, we see in percentage point terms only a small reduction in the pay disparities. But for example, in Denmark, which is one of the countries that's been studied, a 2% reduction in a pay disparity in a country where the pay disparity is 8%, that's a 25% reduction, which is sizable. Okay, so they were in a good position to start with. So if we generalize that to other countries, we're looking at a robust impact of this on the one hand. On the other hand, there's some recent research done in the UK that indicates that when countries become more pay transparent and employees are able to see just how large these disparities are, the bad news has an effect, right, on the company's reputation. And the scholars in this case assess reputation on the basis of surveys done by an online company called Glassdoor, which you may have heard of. This is a company that actually makes it easy for employees to report on their pay and make pay transparent, a report about pay work conditions in companies. So when companies have pay becomes transparent and employees see the bad news, they take a hit on reputation. When companies report the good news that they're actually improving in terms of reduced pay disparities, or that their pay disparities are lower relative to the country average, it doesn't seem to have much of an effect. We take for granted that companies are doing it right, and it's only when companies are doing it wrong that their reputation takes the hit. So all of these things, I think, are driving public policy, and there's more that public policy can do. Public policy is kind of limited. The types of regulations that are being adopted to some degree rely on the good faith of employers. And there's more work that needs to be done to really ensure that those policy initiatives are achieving their objectives.
Okay, yeah. How do pay transparency practices differ across industries and regions? Are there any notable examples of companies or countries leading the way?
So they do vary across countries and regions. In Europe, like I said, in Europe, the EU directive has actually gone far further than most other regions in the world in pushing for pay transparency. We see variance within Europe. For example, currently the German regulations are rather ambiguous, and studies indicate that they are yet to really drive a change in employer behavior. They're rather complex. It's not so easy for employees to take action based on their rights in the German law, as opposed to the laws in the UK, which I guess is not part of the EU anymore. But when those laws were adopted in the UK, the UK was still part of the EU. Those laws go a little bit further. In the US, we see tremendous variance. There's no federal law about disclosing employer disclosure of pay. Like I said, there is federal law in terms of ensuring the right of employees to disclose their pay to one another. But in terms of employer disclosure of pay, there's no one countrywide law. These are laws adopted often by states in the US, to some degree, even by cities in the US, right? There may be no state law, but a particular city enacts a law. And that law applies to any corporation employing more than 2 people often in that city, and is generalizable to the company's employees outside of the city as well. So it's difficult to say these are region-specific laws. The laws are variable in the US from state to state, and around the world from country to country. In some cases, for example, in Israel, the law requires employers to report to a government organization about gender pay disparities, with some access to individuals to see that information, similar to the German law. In some of the laws in the US, for the state laws in the US, companies are required to actually publicly report pay ranges for positions for which they're recruiting, making that information available to potential candidates, and in some cases to current employees. So that sounds great, right? So now you can see I'm applying for a position, and the pay rate for this position ranges between $50,000 and $150,000. But what's to stop an employer from saying the pay ranges between $20,000 and $500,000, a really wide range, and no one's getting paid 20 and no one's getting paid 500. And essentially what they're reporting is nonsense and provides me with no information because I still don't know what the range is in between. Is that illegal? No. That's where I bring up this issue of good faith. So how far do you want to go with these regulations? Some regions, countries, cities have gone further in specifying requirements. Others specify less. Some go to the extent where they don't necessarily deal with actual disclosure of pay amounts, but they regulate the type of information that employers are able to acquire from employees. So part of pay transparency has to do with employers' requests for information from employees that could further gender-based inequities, for example, pay inequities. Let me give you an example. When people apply for a position, they are very often asked, what was their pay in their last position, right? So if a woman is asked, what was your pay in the last position, and she was underpaid in that last position relative to the males in that same job, and now she's hired by a new company at a pay rate, which is a little bit more than what she was paid in the previous job, what we're actually doing is reinforcing those gender-based pay disparities. So some places around the world, states in the US, for example, now make it illegal for employers to request past pay information. You cannot ask an employee what was their previous pay, right? So there are lots and lots of ways that public policy can address this issue. We haven't found the perfect solution yet.
Professor Peter, how does pay transparency affect organizational culture and trust between employees and management?
So transparency seems to have a pretty clear effect on trust as a basic aspect of organizational culture. You know, if you think about organizations, very often CEOs like to talk about how they have a family culture in their organization, right? But when you talk to family therapists, they'll tell you that a family that keeps secrets from one another tends to be a dysfunctional family, right? So the analogy is pretty clear. If a company is trying to develop a culture of a family, they're going to be developing a dysfunctional culture if they are focusing on secrets. Now, I'm not necessarily proposing that everything come out into the open, but the opposite is also problematic. Keeping secrets, in particular about how resources are being allocated, can be very, very problematic. And it generates a sense of suspicion, potentially some distrust. And this has implications on interpersonal relations and relations between labor and management more generally that tend to be rather negative. I'm not saying that labor and management necessarily agree on how rewards should be allocated. I mean, if we look at collective bargaining around the world, it's bargaining, right? But at least it's transparent and it's based on open books. Both sides try to gain information from the other. In some cases, the regulations requiring management to open the books to labor to some degree. In some cases, management simply opens the book to labor to be able to say, we're constrained, our ability to pay is limited. That may make for contentious labor management relations, but the fact that management's being open about it usually leads to some sort of an agreement more in favor of management on the basis of building trust between labor and management and avoiding strikes, right? So we do have a long history, particularly through collective bargaining, where being open and transparent, more open and more transparent, breeds greater trust. And in the book, I actually provide a case study about one company based in Australia, a high-tech company that had complete distributed pay transparency. Everyone in the organization knew each other's pay. Everyone in the organization could comment on each other's pay. and was involved in setting each other's pay, often fighting for increased pay for someone else, and being honest and open, saying, there's no basis for raising the pay of any one individual, including the CEO, when those cases arose. Now, that particular company spent a lot of time and effort all year long dealing with these issues of how rewards should be allocated. A lot of time went into this. But what many people in that company told me is that even though they put more time than most companies put into in determining pay rates, with everyone being a part of the discussion, and we're talking about a company of about 200 employees, for many, the issue became a non-issue, right? The fact that it was open and transparent just made it, to them, a kind of, this is, what we have in place is legitimate and fair, and I don't really have to pay much attention or thought to it, because I know, because it's open, any concerns I have, I can raise and will be addressed. But for the most part, I don't have to think about it, and I can focus on my work. And most of the employees in that company felt that this was really a critical part of their culture. Without being open about pay, there could never be full trust in the organization, because this is one of the most contentious issues in any organization, how rewards are allocated between labor and management. With it being open, it became a non-issue, and the focus could be on the tasks at hand. And the company was extremely successful, to the point that it was recently sold for way more than what the owners ever expected to receive.
Professor, what legal and ethical considerations should organizations be aware of when implementing pay transparency policies?
What types of laws do they need to be aware of when implementing pay transparency?
Yes.
As far as I understand, there are no legal restrictions on disclosing information about pay pretty well anywhere. Employers that want to disclose that information, or information about how they make pay-related decisions, that process or procedural pay transparency, there's nothing in their way from a legal perspective that's stopping them. The only thing that comes to mind are perhaps privacy concerns of employees. And this potentially could be a contentious issue, with an employee stating that, my pay is my personal information, and you, my employer, have no right to make this information public. That's for me to do if I decide to do so, not for you as an employer. I don't think, from a legal perspective, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know, and I'm not aware of any case that's actually come to the courts about this, but I would doubt that position would hold any water, as we would say, simply because the pay that's allocated by an organization to an employee, that's a decision made by the employer, and the employer has the right to make public that decision if they so wish, like any other decision that they wish to make. And any restrictions on making public their justification for a decision, or talking about the decisions that they make, if the shareholders don't like it, they could work to fire those executives. But the organization is able to make public what they want to make public. So I don't think there's any tremendous legal risk, in making pay information public. You do run the risk as a manager, as an employer, if you make a particular individual's pay public, that you'll be indeed violating what they view as their privacy rights. And they may pick up and decide that they don't want to work in an organization like that, and they rather work elsewhere. So you could potentially lose an employee. That's a price you may pay. So it's important to be aware of employees' privacy concerns. Most employees are very interested in knowing about others' pay. They're less interested in making their pay information available to others. No one wants to be envied, for example, right? That's not a pleasant situation. Makes for difficult work relationships, and therefore we do have to respect individual privacy rights. So from a policy perspective, there's this need to balance individual privacy rights with the instrumental benefits and economic benefits of providing more pay information. After all markets, and labor markets are included in that, tend to work more efficiently to the extent that people have more market-related information.
Professor, based on your research and finding, what best practices would you recommend for organizations looking to transition to a more transparent pay structure?
So let's go back to those three different forms of pay transparency that I mentioned, because there are different policies and practices for each one of them. First of all, in terms of restricting employee rights to communicate their pay, my recommendation is to put no restrictions in place whatsoever. I think those types of restrictions are antiquated, particularly in light of the availability of third-party internet-based pay information platforms like Glassdoor or PayScale, where any employee can anonymously post their pay. And economists have found that the information that's on those third-party websites is highly accurate. So when we look at employer pay surveys, employers spend a lot of money to participate and get access to data on pay from consultant pay surveys. When we compare the results of those pay surveys with what appears on Glassdoor, we see remarkable similarity. So employees can easily report their pay and communicate their pay to one another using these third-party systems. Why restrict it? In terms of some of our own research looking at what happens when you restrict pay information, what we find is that employees, this was a study that we did in Australia, it's generally counterproductive for the employer because it doesn't stop the employees from disclosing on the one hand. On the other hand, it does generate a negative outcome in terms of the employee's perspective on the company and the culture of the company. So with regard to employee-to-employee pay disclosure, there's no real benefit of keeping limitations on that. In terms of pay process transparency and providing employees with greater information about how pay decisions are made and how the pay system is being structured, our research indicates that this is a win-win. The more information you can provide to employees to explain the basis for pay decisions in the organizations, the better the implications in terms of employee trust in the employer, and more importantly, task performance improves because employees get a much better understanding of what it is exactly that employers want to pay for, right? They also get typically insights into their benefits. Most employees have very limited insight into benefits, which account for, in most organizations, over 30% of the total rewards. If you don't have insight into 30% of your remuneration, it means you're potentially losing out. I mean, when I was starting out as a professor, I was completely unaware of the benefits that were available to me. It took about 10 years for me to get a fairly good understanding of all the benefits that were available to me. And I look back in the previous 10 years, recognizing that I could have leveraged many of these benefits that I never did, and it would have saved me a lot of money had I known that they existed. And potentially, it might have saved my employer from me moving to another employer, right, from one university to another, where I thought I was making more money, when in fact I was basically making the same, but I just didn't know how much I was making because of lack of information about the benefits. So employee pay knowledge is really important. And from our own research, we find that it only generates a higher sense of procedural justice, fairness about procedures in the organization, which have huge benefits in terms of task performance, contextual performance in terms of, for example, helping employees collaborating and helping one another. So here it's a win-win for employees and employers. The contentious issue has to do with disclosing actual pay rates, right? Distributive pay transparency. And here it's really risky to disclose individual level pay rates. All of our experiments demonstrate that this has benefits in terms of task performance when employees understand how much it's worth to actually contribute like another individual that they're aware of, on the one hand. On the other hand, it generates perhaps those collaboration problems that I mentioned earlier. So a better approach probably is to aggregate the pay information to the level of ranges, for example, and make clear to individuals how much the minimum is and how much the maximum is for the particular job that they're engaged in. And to compare those ranges from one position in the organization to another, okay? Now, this is problematic for many employers because what we would see from that is that executives, for example, are making potentially 300 or 400 times what the average worker is making in the organization. Can that be justified? And the answer in many cases is no, but in some cases you might be able to say, yes, it is justified because the labor market is demanding that that's what we pay in order to get the kind of leadership that we want to have in this organization that's going to sustain your job, okay? So it means that they're going to be difficult conversations, but it avoids many of those problems that we have by a lack of transparency, and it's kind of a mid-range approach. This is why in many places around the world, we find policymakers moving towards this kind of middle range approach with all of the problems associated with it.
Yeah. Professor, last question. How do you see the future of pay transparency evolving, especially with advances in technology and changing workforce expectations?
So I think technology is going to naturally make many things much more transparent, including pay. It's going to be increasingly easy for employees to access pay information. And emerging technologies are going to allow this. We don't know how AI is going to affect this, but I suspect there are going to be large language models that allow us to access with a fairly good degree of accuracy how much different positions are making within the organization, and perhaps how much individuals are making within the organization without any actual disclosure by the individual or by the organization. So I think that's going to be interesting. I think at the same time, we're going to see both the courts and policymakers examining what the implications are of existing or recently adopted pay transparency regulations and tweaking some of those regulations. So economists are studying that. They're doing research that's often called difference in differences to look at comparing different groups that are forced by regulations to adopt more transparent practices versus others that are not, perhaps because they're smaller organizations, and then comparing these two types of organizations in terms of whether we see a reduction in gender pay disparities, whether we see harmful effects in terms of turnover rates, productivity. We need to better understand what the implications of pay transparency are when policymakers put in place regulations pushing these practices to become more transparent. Once we see what those effects are, and we're beginning to see that now, I suspect that policymakers will be shifting the policies in place, be perfecting it. So beyond that, it's difficult to say where the future is going to go in this area. But we've come a long, long way in the past 20 years, a huge way in the past 20 years.
Thank you, Professor Peter Bamberger, for joining us today and sharing your profound insight into the complex dynamics of pay transparency. Your research provides a crucial understanding of how pay transparency impacts employees, employers, and public policy, offering a fresh perspective on a topic that is increasingly relevant in today's organizational landscape. The insights you have shared will undoubtedly inspire both thought and action among our listeners. To our audience, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Business Talk podcast. Until next time, I am Deepak signing off. Thank you, Professor Peter Bamberger. Thank you so much.